The old man at the end of the bar went still the moment he saw the coin in my hand. Not the restless kind of still that comes from surprise. The deep kind. The kind that only happens when someone sees something they were certain no longer existed. He didn't say anything at first. He set down his glass. He looked at the coin, then at me, then at the coin again. His jaw shifted slightly, the way a person's does when they're choosing their words with more care than the situation seems to call for. "Where did you get that?" he asked. I told him it belonged to my grandfather, that he'd passed away 3 weeks ago. The old man exhaled slowly through his nose. He looked like he'd just been handed a letter he'd been expecting for 30 years and still wasn't ready to open. "Your grandfather," he said quietly. "What was his name?" "Walter Pruitt," I said. He closed his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them, his voice had changed, lower, careful, like he was measuring each word before releasing it. "We need to talk somewhere else," he said. "Not here." That was the moment I understood that my grandfather, the man my own mother had called a waste of a life, might have been someone I never knew at all. My grandfather lived in a narrow 2-story house in Cookeville, Tennessee, the kind of place that looks like it gave up on itself sometime around 1987 and never quite recovered. Peeling paint on the shutters. A front porch that listed slightly to the left. A yard that was always one missed, mowing away from being a problem. He drove a truck so old the passenger window only rolled down halfway, and he liked it that way. He said the wind coming in halfway was enough for anyone. He was not a man who took up much space. He spoke in short sentences. He laughed rarely, but when he did it was the real kind, sudden and unguarded, like something escaped. He kept mostly to himself. He had 3 friends that I knew of, all of them men around his age, all of them equally quiet, and they met every Thursday morning at a diner on Main Street, and none of them seemed to say very much, but they kept meeting anyway for decades. My mother called him difficult. My uncle said he was just depressed and too stubborn to do anything about it. At family holidays, he sat at the far end of the table and answered questions in ways that politely closed conversations rather than opened them. My mother stopped inviting him after a while. She said it was because he made things uncomfortable, that he never tried to connect. I was the only one who disagreed with that assessment. I disagreed with it my entire childhood, and I disagreed with it the day he died. Because every time I sat with him on that listing front porch, he asked me questions. Real ones. Not what are you studying, or how are your grades, but what do you think happens to the places that nobody visits anymore? Do you believe people can change after 60? What's the bravest thing you ever did that nobody saw? He listened to my answers like they mattered. He was the only adult in my life who did that without making me feel like I was being evaluated. When I enlisted in the army at 22, he was the only family member who didn't ask me why. He just nodded and said, "Good. Pay attention." I didn't understand what he meant then. I do now. He died on a Tuesday in October. Alone, in that narrow house, in the bedroom at the top of the stairs. His neighbor noticed the mail piling up and called it in. By the time anyone got there, he had been gone for almost 2 days. I was doing a training rotation in Georgia when I got the call. I drove 8 hours that night. My mother flew in 2 days later, not to help with arrangements, but to figure out what to do with the house. My uncle sent a card. It arrived after the funeral. There were 11 people at the service. I counted because it felt important to count. A pastor who had met my grandfather exactly once. The Thursday morning diner group. 2 women from his neighborhood who brought casseroles nobody ate. A man in a VFW cap who stood in the back and left before I could speak to him. And me. I was the one who chose the casket. I was the one who picked the hymns. I was the one who stood at the grave in my dress uniform, in the October cold, listening to the wind move through the cemetery trees, thinking about how a man could live 81 years and have this be the sum of it. 11 people and a listing house full of things nobody wanted. After the service, I went back to clear it out. Most of what I found was ordinary. Clothes that smelled like cedar and motor oil. Canned goods in the pantry organized by category. Books on World War II and Cold War history, the spines worn soft from reading. VHS tapes of old westerns. In the kitchen drawer, a collection of pens that all worked, and rubber bands that hadn't dried out yet, because he was the kind of man who maintained small things with a consistency most people reserve for important ones. I worked through the house room by room. I was nearly done with the upstairs when I found the closet in the small back bedroom, the one he used as a study. Behind a row of hanging coats, pushed against the wall and tucked underneath an old shoebox, was a flat metal lockbox, the kind you'd use for documents. Olive green. Military surplus. Maybe. No key. No label. I brought it to the kitchen table and used a flathead screwdriver to open it. Inside were 4 things. A folded photograph of a group of young men in civilian clothes standing in front of a building I didn't recognize, in a city that looked Eastern European but had no identifying markers. My grandfather was in the back row, 3rd from the left. He looked like he was in his late 20s. He wasn't smiling, but his posture was different from any photo of him I'd ever seen. Straight, alert, like someone who knew exactly where the exits were. A small notebook with a red cover, filled with strings of numbers and abbreviations in his handwriting. No explanations. No names. A letter, unsealed, addressed to no one, written in his careful block print. And the coin. It was about the size of a $50. Heavy for its size. Matte black on one face, with a compass rose stamped into it and a set of coordinates engraved along the rim. On the other face, a simple designation. 3 letters and a number that meant nothing to me. No branch insignia, no motto. Nothing that would help me understand what it was or where it came from. I read the letter that night, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold beside me. If you're reading this, I'm gone. And you cared enough to look where most people wouldn't. There are things about my life I was never permitted to explain. That wasn't cowardice. It was the agreement. I kept it because I believed it mattered, and some part of me still does. What I can tell you is this. I was not what your family thought I was. I was not lost. I was not wasted. I was not depressed, and too proud to say so. I was busy. For a very long time, I was very busy, doing work that required me to appear as if I had done nothing at all. If the coin finds someone who recognizes it, tell them it was mine, that I kept my word to the end. That's all you'll need to say. I'm sorry I couldn't explain it to you sooner. You were always the one I wanted to tell. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I folded it carefully, put it back in the box, and took the coin with me when I left. I didn't know what to do with any of it at first. I went back to base. I went back to routine. I ran in the mornings and ate in the mess hall and did my job, and tried not to think too hard about a man I was no longer going to be able to ask questions, but the coin stayed with me. I carried it in my jacket pocket. Sometimes I took it out and turned it over, reading the coordinates along the rim, tracing the compass rose with my thumb. I looked up the coordinates online. They mapped to a location in Vienna, Austria. That was when I stopped treating it like a keepsake and started treating it like a question. I reached out to a retired Army intelligence officer I'd met during a joint exercise the previous year. She had spent 20 years in signals intelligence before retiring to teach at a university in Virginia. She was the kind of person who gave you the impression she knew 3 things about everything and would only ever tell you one of them. I sent her a photo of the coin without any context. Just the coin, both faces. She called me back within 2 hours. "Where did you get this?" she said. It wasn't a question. Exactly. More like the beginning of a calculation she was already running. I told her it was my grandfather's. There was a long pause. "What branch did he serve in?" "Army," I said. Or at least, that's what his discharge papers said. Signal Corps. "Did he ever talk about his posting?" "Never," I said. "He didn't talk about any of it." Another pause. "What was his name?" When I told her, she exhaled slowly. "I need to make a call," she said. "Don't show that coin to anyone else, and don't put photos of it online." She hung up before I could ask why. I sat in my car in the parking lot outside my barracks and looked at the coin for a long time. I had spent 3 weeks carrying it around like a piece of my grandfather. I was beginning to understand it might be something else entirely. 2 weeks later, she put me in contact with a man named Raymond Callister. He was the man at the end of the bar. The one who went still. We met at his request at a restaurant outside Bethesda, Maryland, the kind of anonymous place with low lighting and enough background noise to make conversation private without trying. He arrived before me. He was in his late 70s, stocky, with a white crew cut and the hands of someone who had spent time outdoors doing things that required grip. He was wearing civilian clothes, but he sat with his back to the wall and watched the door. When I sat across from him, he studied me for a moment before he spoke. I worked with your grandfather for 11 years, he said. I thought about him a lot over the decades. I wondered sometimes what happened to him after he came back. He came back to Cookville, I said. He lived there until he died. Callister nodded slowly. Alone? Mostly, I said. My family wasn't close to him. He absorbed that without showing much on his face. But I saw something shift behind his eyes. Something that looked like it cost him something. Tell me what you know, he said, about his service. I told him what I had. The discharge papers listing Signal Corps. The dates. The nothing else. That's what they would show, he said. That's what they were supposed to show. What was he actually doing? Calatin turned his coffee cup in his hands. Your grandfather was what we called a handler, he said. He ran assets. Human intelligence sources on the other side of the Iron Curtain. People who were feeding us information from inside Soviet bloc governments, military installations, intelligence services. He recruited them. He managed them. He kept them alive. I heard myself ask the question calmly, even though nothing about what I was feeling was calm. For how long? From 1971 to 1982, he said. 11 years. 3 different cover postings. Vienna once. Budapest twice. One stretch in Berlin that I won't go into detail about because some of it's still technically classified. He told us he worked in communications, I said. Logistics support. That was the cover, Callister said. Good cover looks boring. People stop asking questions about boring. I thought about every family gathering where someone had made a joke at my grandfather's expense. About the neighbor who said he seemed like a man with nothing to show for himself. About my mother's voice when she said he never tried. The people he ran, I said. What happened to them? Some of them are still alive, Callister said. Some of them have grandchildren now. Some of them are in countries they would never have been able to stay in if your grandfather hadn't pulled them out when the timing changed. He paused. He lost 2 over the years. It marked him. He never stopped carrying that. The noise of the restaurant faded into the kind of background hum that happens when your brain is working too hard to process sound correctly. Why didn't anyone recognize him? I asked. Afterward, when he came home, Callister looked at me steadily. Because recognizing him would require acknowledging the operations existed, he said, which they officially didn't. He understood that going in. He accepted it. He shouldn't have had to accept it, I said. My voice came out more controlled than I expected. No, Callister said quietly. He shouldn't have. I put the coin on the table between us. He looked at it for a long moment without touching it. The unit designation, he said. I haven't seen one of these in a long time. He finally picked it up and turned it over. Most of us handed them in when the program ended. Some of us didn't. He set it back down and slid it toward me. He kept his. The letter he left said it reminded him of what he'd done, I said. Callister nodded. That sounds like Walter. I picked the coin back up. The metal was warm from where he'd held it. Was he good at it? I asked. At what he did. The old man's expression shifted into something complicated. Pride and grief mixed together in a way that only happens when you're thinking about someone you couldn't protect. The best I ever worked with, he said. The absolute best. I drove back from Bethesda in the dark, taking the long way without meaning to, just driving while the highway unspooled ahead of me, and my grandfather's whole life rearranged itself inside my head. He had sat at the far end of that table at every holiday. He had answered questions in ways that gently closed conversations. He had let my mother call him a waste without correcting her. He had lived in that narrow house with its listing porch and its organizational logic and its books on Cold War history, reading about a world he'd operated inside of, a world that had agreed he was never there. He had never once demanded to be seen. I thought about that for a long time on that dark highway. About what it costs a person to carry something like that for decades and choose, over and over again, to put it back down quietly rather than set it on the table where everyone could see. I went home that weekend. Not to my apartment. To my mother's house. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, which is where she always was when she needed to think about something other than whatever she was thinking about. She hugged me the way she always did. Quick and practiced, then offered me coffee she knew I'd turn down. I put the photograph on the counter. She looked at it. For a moment she didn't say anything. Where did this come from? She asked. His house, I said. The back bedroom. She picked it up and looked at my grandfather's face in it, young and alert in a foreign city, and I watched something move across her expression that she didn't quite manage to keep down. "Do you know what you're looking at?" I asked. She set the photograph down. "It's just an old photo." "He's in Vienna," I said. "He was running intelligence assets behind the Iron Curtain for 11 years. The Signal Corps posting was a cover. He spent most of his career keeping people alive in countries where the wrong conversation could get you killed." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I stopped expecting her to say something and was almost surprised when she did. "That's not possible," she said. But her voice was wrong for the words. Too thin. "I met someone who worked with him," I said. "A man named Callister. He knew grandfather for 11 years. He said he was the best handler he ever worked with." My mother turned toward the window above the sink. Outside, the backyard was gray and still. She stood there with her hands flat on the counter and I could see her breathing. "He never said a word," she said finally. "He couldn't," I said. "It was classified." "For 40 years? Some of it still is." She turned back toward me. Her eyes were wet, but her face had gone tight in the way people's faces do when they're trying to absorb something that's too large to absorb all at once, and they're angry that it's too large. "We thought," she started. She stopped. "I thought he just didn't want to be close to anyone. That something had broken in him and he'd decided not to fix it." "He was protecting you," I said. "Not from the truth specifically, but from being in a position where you knew enough to be asked questions. Handlers don't just disappear. Their families sometimes became leverage." She put her hand over her mouth. "He sat at the end of that table every Thanksgiving," I said. "He drove 4 hours to get there, and he sat at the end of the table and watched us. That's what he had. That was all he was allowed to have." My mother didn't say anything, but she sat down, and for the first time since I was a child, she looked like she didn't know what to do next. I called my uncle that evening. His response was different from my mother's. He was quiet for a long time and then said, slowly, "I used to make fun of him, to his face, sometimes, about not having anything to show for himself." Another silence. "Does that count, do you think? As something you can't take back?" I didn't know what to say to that, so I told him the truth. "I think he already forgave you. I think he forgave all of us a long time ago. I think that was part of the job for him, too." I went back to see Callister one more time. About a month later, I brought the notebook. He sat across from me in the same restaurant and paged through it slowly, his expression going through things I couldn't fully read. After a while, he looked up. "These are operational logs," he said. "Dates, locations, asset contact codes. Your grandfather kept his own record." He turned a few more pages. "This is not something he was supposed to do." "Is it dangerous?" I asked. "That it exists? At this point?" He shook his head. "The people in here are either dead or old enough that it doesn't matter anymore. The operations are 40 years gone." He closed the notebook carefully. "But it's the only record I know of that isn't redacted to nothing." He paused. He was meticulous. He always was. "What should I do with it?" He thought about that for a moment. "There are archivists at certain institutions who handle this kind of material appropriately. I can give you a name. The notebook should be preserved, not destroyed." He met my eyes. "Your grandfather documented things that history should know happened, even if history agreed to pretend it didn't." I asked him the question I had been sitting with for weeks. "Did he ever talk about being lonely?" Callister looked out the window. The light outside was flat and cold. "Once," he said, "near the end of his last posting, when we both knew the program was winding down and we'd be going back to lives that wouldn't have a name for what we'd been doing." He paused. He said the hardest part wasn't the danger. It wasn't the secrecy. It was knowing that the people you cared about most would have the least accurate picture of who you were. The restaurant hummed around us. "He asked me once if I thought the quiet was worth it," Callister said. I told him I honestly didn't know. He nodded like that was a fair answer. He turned back to me. He never asked me again. My mother planned the second service. That surprised me more than anything else about the months that followed. She was the one who made the calls, who reached out to the VFW post, who tracked down the man in the veteran's cap who had stood at the back of the funeral and disappeared before I could speak to him. His name was Donald Hester. He had served 2 years alongside my grandfather in Vienna. He had been trying to find a way to come to the original funeral, and hadn't managed it in time. He cried when my mother called him. She told me afterward that she hadn't expected that, and that it had changed something in her. That hearing a stranger cry for her father made her understand that the stranger had known a version of her father she had never met. The second service was held in March, at the same cemetery, on a cold blue morning. There were more people this time. Callister came. Donald Hester came, with his wife. 3 other men I didn't recognize who stood together near the back in the same quiet way that said they had known my grandfather through the same channel. There were no military honors, no flags, no formal acknowledgement. That was intentional. My grandfather had lived without official recognition, and we were not going to manufacture it now. Instead, we told stories. The neighbors talked about the time he spent 3 weekends helping them rebuild a fence after a storm, refusing payment of any kind, showing up each morning with his own tools. Donald Hester talked about a night in Vienna in 1976 that he couldn't give details about, but that he said ended with 3 people on a train out of the country who would otherwise not have made it. He said my grandfather had made a decision that night that took a specific kind of courage, and that he had never seen anyone make it so quietly. My mother stood at the grave and said something I didn't expect her to say. "I spent a long time believing that the people who mattered were the ones you could see clearly," she said. "I think he knew that about me. I think he accepted it." She paused. I wish he hadn't had to. My uncle placed a folded flag against the headstone. Not the kind that comes from a military funeral with the ceremony attached. Just a flag. The gesture was enough. I stood at the back and held the coin in my closed hand and thought about a 28-year-old man in a foreign city, making a calculation about what his life would cost, and deciding it was worth it, and then coming home to a town in Tennessee and living quietly with that decision for 50 years, feeding birds in his backyard, meeting his friends on Thursday mornings, asking his granddaughter real questions and listening to her answers like they mattered. He had not been invisible. He had chosen not to be seen. There is a difference, and it took me a long time to understand it. The coin is on my desk now as I write this. I don't carry it in my pocket anymore. It doesn't need to go everywhere with me the way it did at first, when I was still working out what it meant. My mother calls more than she used to. She asks questions about my grandfather now, real ones, the kind that don't have easy answers, and she sits with the answers instead of closing the conversation down. She started volunteering at the Veterans Center in her city, 2 mornings a week, listening to old men talk about things they have carried for a long time. She told me recently that she's starting to understand what listening without rushing feels like. My uncle drove to Cookville and sat in the diner where my grandfather met his Thursday morning friends. He introduced himself to the men still living. They let him sit with them for an hour. He said they didn't talk much, but that it felt like something anyway. I made a career decision recently, not a dramatic one. I put in for a posting that will require exactly the kind of patience and attention my grandfather was describing all those years ago on his front porch, when he asked me what was the bravest thing I'd ever done that nobody saw. I didn't have a good answer then. I'm working on one now. The notebook is with an archivist at a university in Washington. The photograph is framed on my wall. The letter is in the metal box, with the other things I intend to keep. The coin I'll hold on to for reasons I don't entirely know how to explain yet. My grandfather was not a difficult man. He was not broken. He was not a waste of a life. He was a man who spent 11 years in the careful, dangerous, unglamorous work of keeping people alive, and then came home and spent 50 more years being ordinary about it, asking his granddaughter real questions, fixing things that were broken rather than throwing them away, meeting his friends every Thursday morning because consistency was a form of love he had room for. He knew that we didn't see him clearly. He forgave us for it and went right on being who he was. That kind of grace is not small. That kind of grace is enormous. And it doesn't require an audience to be real. I think about the things I have carried that no one could see. The decisions made in quiet that shaped everything that came after. The work that doesn't have a ceremony. The choices that don't get remembered because they were made too softly to echo. I think about all the people like my grandfather, still out there, sitting at the end of the table, watching the room, waiting for someone to ask a real question. Ask the question. You don't know yet what you'll find.